Craig here. I'm here with Professor Marion Nestle. Hi there, Professor.
Hi.
Thanks for joining me. Professor Nestle is Professor Emerita at New York University and author of the best-selling Food Politics. I'm so happy you're joining me. Uh, we're here because we connect. We don't know each other, but we're connecting over my new book, which is called Pandemic, The Unmasking of America, which is behind me here. That's the cover. And I'm a photographer and a writer, and at the beginning of COVID, so I live in the city, but wound up here where my in-laws live. They have a small cattle farm, and this is this sort of the former dairy region of upstate New York. And I say former dairy region because after generations of dairy farming up until the 1980s, when the consolidation of the industry happened, because of deregulation and such, a lot of these family farms just went out. And when you drive around the area here, you see the blight. It's if time stopped back then. It really performed a perfect backdrop for what COVID seemed to me at the time. Of course, I just grabbed my camera because I didn't know what to do, because let me just find some sense of control. And that what we thought would be 2 weeks led to all of a sudden now we're in the middle of May. And they cleaned the subways, and I said, let me go down to the city and check the mail. And of course, then I wanted to photograph the empty subways and empty city. And then the third part was the Black Lives Matter protest that broke out. And by the time I was done, it formed a narrative and a visual narrative. And it was a narrative of a story I've been telling for probably about at least 30, 40 years, which is about what's wrong with our relationship with food in our society. Right. And I know this is where we connect. And, what I saw was going on in these areas where there's so much, it's really the blight of rural America. You see dollar stores, you see people with no access to fresh food. The same thing you might see in the inner city. We talk about institutional racism, of all kinds of things, policing and such, but the institutional racism of our food policy and how it ended up. We could see how the genius of propaganda and marketing of the food processing industry to convince people, that, your traditional foods are no longer any good and you should eat these kind of newfangled processed things. And that to go so far, maybe the 70s, 80s, you know better, to come up with this sort of low-fat diet plan, which 30 years later ended up with this sort of chronic obesity and diabetes and metabolic diseases that ended up leading to the worst COVID outcomes. I mean, it's such a crazy story, but maybe you can kind of thread that together, because you come into this as sort of, when I talk about some of the heroes, for how we can get out of this. This is really the story that you've been telling. I assume our mutual friend Joan Gussow has been telling, and Karen Washington, who's been doing urban farming, and people with real solutions. So can you kind of jump in and piece some of this together and help it make some sense?
Well, you started with the dairy industry in upstate New York, and this is one of the great tragedies of America, is what's happened to small dairy farms. They've been cut out of the consolidation and concentration of American agriculture. Big has driven out small, and they're, going out of business one after another, despite their very effective use of the land. And this has been the story of the food industry in the United States since 1980. 1980 was a pretty critical year. It's when President Reagan was elected, who came in with a deregulatory agenda and did a really good job of it. And that was when all semblance of trying to control agriculture so farmers could make a living stopped, and it was just do what you can, and anything is fair game, and we're going to subsidize big, not small. So that's what's happened, and it's a very sad story. And if you go into rural America now, and I also am in upstate New York at the moment, and you see it, you see these town after town after town with closed movie theaters and boarded up stores. And of course, the pandemic isn't helping any of that.
Yeah, yeah. And the irony, though, of having this sort of marketing-driven food policy, where sort of the best minds of marketing and the best minds of food chemistry and somehow get together with governmental agencies and the media, and somehow this whole story gets woven into eating in a way that is different than the way that we've eaten before traditionally, and particularly in the story of how the sort of 80s low fat thing ended up to this particular point, right? About how the propaganda of the industry to sell people low fat foods and processed foods and such, and then it ended up now with these chronic metabolic diseases.
Yes, I think there's a cause and effect problem here that I don't think these are causally related. I was working for the Reagan administration in the late 1980s, and was the editor of a report called the Surgeon General's Report on Nutrition and Health. And the person I was working for wrote the executive summary of that, and his executive summary said that the most important problem in American diets was eating too much fat. The reason for that was that you couldn't talk about meat. Saturated fat was clearly a risk factor, raising blood cholesterol levels and raising the risk of coronary heart disease. That has not changed. Saturated fat is still a problem. The main source of saturated fat in American diets was beef, and you couldn't say eat less beef in a government report about diet and health. That was politically impossible because the meat industry is very powerful. Cattle are grown in every state in the union. Every state has 2 senators. The meat industry gets to Congress very, very quickly if the government is trying to say anything about eating less meat. And so you couldn't do that. So they talked about saturated fat instead of meat. And the idea was that if you cut down saturated fat, you would automatically be cutting down on meat products because that was the main source of them. And so you didn't have to advise people to eat less meat. You could just say, cut down on saturated fat. Mm-hmm. But what nobody thought of at the time, and nobody realized, was that the food industry would immediately begin to make products that were just as high or higher in calories, but had no fat in them. And so that was the Snackwell's phenomenon, where Snackwell's cookies were advertised as no fat. They had just as many calories, or almost as many calories, as the ones that did have fat, and they made up the calories with sugar. So the issue with body weight is calories. It really doesn't matter where the calories come from. And it's unfortunate that the government agencies couldn't be more direct about what they meant.
Yeah, and now and how this ties in, it's sort of in the marketing point to these poorer communities, right? So like like in these neighborhoods, you have Dollar General, and you have a lot of obesity. I mean, look, we want to talk about COVID in America, and what people don't talk about is that we're 70% overweight and the highest obesity in developed countries and such, and how this plays in, because what is it, almost 80 or 90%, they say, the people who have the worst COVID outcomes have some of these chronic metabolic diseases, including obesity and diabetes and such, which result from eating all, kind of a lot of these kinds of not nutrient-dense foods, right, but caloric-dense,
calorie-dense foods.
Calorie-dense foods.
These are calorie-dense foods. The entire purpose of American food policy for a long time has been to keep the price of food as cheap as possible. And we're now paying the price for our cheap food policy in obesity and the chronic diseases for which obesity raises risk. Obesity is not a death sentence, but it does raise the risk of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and other problems. And it certainly raises the risk for COVID-19, for bad outcomes of COVID-19. And as long as ultra processed, what are now called, the new buzzword is ultra processed. It's a fancy word for junk food, but it defines a specific category of junk food that's deliberately formulated to make people just love it and eat as much of it as they possibly can and have no idea what they're eating. So as long as those are the cheapest and most profitable foods, and they're the foods that the food industry is going to make the most money off of, it's very, very difficult for people who don't have a lot of choice and are restricted to rural areas where they just don't have supermarkets with lots and lots of different kinds of foods. And the supermarkets that they do have are more expensive than Dollar General. That's the situation that we're up against. I think the government ought to be subsidizing healthy foods, not junk foods. And we've seen also how the price of healthy foods has gone up much, much faster and further than the price of junk foods.
Yeah.
Since 1980, everything started, and all of this started.
I know 1980. I make that point in the book that 1980 is when it all started. Reagan came in, and deregulation and low tax and all this market worship. We all became sort of just citizens to be cannibalized by the market economy. That we stopped becoming human beings. We just started becoming whatever could be. However they could make a buck. As we say, in very short term.
We became consumers.
Yeah, citizens became consumers, and now to the point that what we see that it's not just the poor communities that are impacted by this. Everybody's now taken down by this because of COVID. And you could even see that the industrial, the pollution, all these polluting factories are in poor areas as well. So this whole policy, which in one sense we could see the institutional racism in the inner cities, but also happens in rural America differently. It seems to be whoever can be harvested to market, because of the prices. But you mentioned the price of healthy food, and I've been around the organic foods movement my whole life, and that's how I know Joan Gussow. And she was probably the first to say that this wasn't the point of the organic label, the USDA label, and it seems like the people who have really benefited has been, big food has come into this area too, of course, but it's become a packaged food, a commodity.
Yes, I like to say that an organic junk food is still a junk food.
Yeah. And Joan wrote that piece back in the 90s, can an organic Twinkie be certified, And that was obviously the point. And then also, organic, like for instance, you want to go, like in my neighborhood in Manhattan, and if I go to Whole Foods or Trader Joe's, which is basically my choice now if I want to buy local organic foods, the prices of, say, sweet peppers, which have to be flown in somehow from Holland and from Canada or from Mexico, when they could be grown in temperate zones, it's crazy. It's just become such a huge industry, and an elitist thing, which Karen Washington made that point about. Organic food has become an elitist.
It's more expensive. It's really simple. It's more expensive, and it's more expensive because of federal policies that make the cost of industrially produced foods and junk foods cheaper. We could change that policy.
Right. So that, I guess that comes, if the idea of me doing a book like this is also to start a conversation in this primarily in this area. How do we then now start? You've been having this conversation for 20 years or more, right?
40.
Okay. Since your book, the first book, 20 years, right? That's about. But how does it take hold now? Because now it's so stark, it's so obvious that this is a root cause of our existential suffering here. Is our health, our poor health, and our relationship with food. we could go back how many, if we want to say 10,000 years of civilization and 40,000 generations roughly, handing down food and traditional food generation to generation. And all of a sudden we get to mid 20th century and that all stops, right? For some kind of everybody eats the same thing that could be advertised, right?
Well, after the Second World War, the transportation system improved enormously, and it was possible to get foods from California all year round, which it hadn't been before. So we have a different kind of food system now, and there's a lot of money in it. Everybody eats every day. There's lots and lots of money in food, and the food industry has exploited that to try to make profits. But to think that food companies are there for reasons of social service or public health is not to understand how business works. Their businesses, like everything else, and their job is to sell as much product at as high a profit as they possibly can. That's what they're about. That's what their stockholders expect. And that's the system that we're up against. So that's why, I think all of the efforts of thousands of groups in the United States to try to grow food locally, the sustainable agriculture movement, the regenerative agriculture movement, the urban farm movement, all of these are very important in trying to change the food system. I'm for them.
Yeah. And so waiting for solutions to come top down seems to be waiting for a long time.
We're going to have a long wait.
Yeah, we're going to have a long wait.
Even, you and I are talking the day after the election. We can't even elect a president.
I know. And here we are. But these sound like the solutions are bottom up, I guess, right? I mean, right now.
They have to be. They have to be bottom up. And that's why I'm in my teaching and in my writing, I've talked about the need to learn how to become food advocates and to advocate for healthier and more sustainable food systems. I think it's a really good thing to do. There are lots of ways of doing it. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people are involved in organizations that are working on these issues. I just wish they could all get together and form one giant coalition that might have some political power. I have hope.
Yeah. I mean, people are in the streets for all kinds of things, looking for justice. I remember maybe about 10 years ago, there was a film about the colony collapse disorder of the honeybees. Mm-hmm. And they were, tying it back then to certain pesticides that were impacting the bees. And in France, when they got word of that erupted in street protests because the French were just like, don't mess with our food, But in this country, which is kind of like it's way under the radar, and the food awareness is left to you have to have some sort of luxury of sophistication. You have to have some luxury of just personal luxury, really, to be able to live a life when you have these to make these choices. My daughter, who's a social work student at NYU right now, keeps reminding me that I'm blaming the victim. When we talk about where do these changes occur, and on a personal level, some people have an easier time, of course, making these changes, and they just choose to eat poorly, and some people have the impediments are just there culturally because of the things that I kind of trying to show in the book, about this. I mean. You talk about the areas up where you are and same around here. It's just unbelievable that it's America, and how to get movements going in these areas. It's real work, and people looking for work. It's a good place to go.
If only they could get paid for it.
I know. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time. This is great because I like I say, I want to use this as an opportunity to start this conversation. And I think it's a foundational conversation, and I really appreciate your work. And I hope we stay in touch.
I hope we do too. And thanks for doing your book. It's beautiful.
Thank you so much. You have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.